Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for an Upside Down World, the Reign of Black Governors in Connecticut with Dr. Kerima Lewis. And before we begin, I just wanted to mention that this presentation is made possible with lead support from UI Lighting Up the Arts. Kerima Lewis teaches history at Massasoit Community College and Emerson College in Massachusetts. She has a BA degree from Northwestern University, an MSW degree from Hunter College School of Social Work, a JD degree from New York University School of Law, and a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Lewis wrote her dissertation on slave resistance in New England. Her article, Captives on the Move, Tracing the Transatlantic Movement of Africans from the West Indies to Colonial New England, was published in the Historical Journal of Massachusetts. She is currently working on a book about slave resistance in New England. Let's welcome Dr. Kerima Lewis.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, New Haven Museum, for this invitation to speak about. I'm going to correct my own title because I'm going to refer to these gentlemen as the Negro governors of New England. And the reason that I do that is because I wanted to be in the correct historical context. Yes, we say Black now, we say African American now, but during this time in the 1700s and in the 1800s, they were referred to either as Negro or colored or African. Okay, and so we're going to be talking about the reign of the Negro governors in New Haven, Connecticut, and beyond. And so we know that slavery existed in the colony of New Haven since its founding in 1638. When Theophilus Eaton, the first governor of New Haven, brought an enslaved woman named Lucretia with him and his family when they arrived with the first settlers. Well, the historian Benjamin Trumbull reports that the first Black slave owned in Connecticut was Louis Berbice, and he was killed at the Dutch fort in Hartford in 1639. But whether it was Lucretia or Louise, we know that the practice of holding human beings in slavery was well established by the 1600s when Connecticut began to issue its first round of restrictive slave laws. And that some of New Haven's finest, its ministers, church leaders, governors, all enslaved people of African descent. This talk tonight will discuss a cultural tradition that emerged in colonial New England during the 18th century when enslaved communities elected their own kings and governors during a time when they were held in bondage and denied basic liberties, including the right to vote. Now, it was always believed that Negro elections grew out of enslaved people imitating the elections of their white enslavers. Yes, I use the word enslaver rather than the word master or owner, because the tenor of the language today is to recognize that people were enslaved, that this sentence of life servitude was put upon them. And so instead of a master or an owner, we say enslaver. That is how the language is being developed today. And so it was always believed that the Negro elections grew out of enslaved people imitating the elections of their white enslavers. White elections included weeks of politicking during large parties in taverns where the beer and the rum flowed until the event turned into a drunken brawl. And I should show this picture of a election in colonial times, where you see it's a large gathering of men, because only men with property could vote in the colonies during this early time. But they're having a good time cajoling and interacting with each other. But only white men, as I said, could cast a vote for the candidates of their choice. A closer look at the Negro elections shows that enslaved Africans and their descendants were not imitating whites, but were rather combining their African tradition of celebrating their kings and chiefs with an electoral process they found in place in New England. There are over 20 enslaved men of African descent who were elected as governors in the communities of Connecticut that were once slave communities of Hartford, New Haven, Wethersfield, Woodbridge, Derby, and Seymour, as well as in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Enslaved men were also elected as king in the royal colonies like New Hampshire. Discussing some of the other Negro governors in Connecticut further demonstrates how enslaved persons continued their African traditions with an American system of elections across New England until the mid-1800s. The men who were elected governor and king were strong, respected, and influential men. A number of these candidates who ran for this office were born in West Africa and were the children or grandchildren of African royalty. The knowledge of one's royal lineage, oh boy, I can't talk today, lineage, you're inheriting that royal position, was not lost to time or to the trauma of crossing the Middle Passage. Boston, a Negro governor of Newark, never lost his African identity, since he held on to his African name, Trow, for his entire life. Squash Pierre of New Haven, who originated from the Akan people of the Gold Coast, because his name in the Akan language would probably be Kwaku or Kwame or something of that order. But by the time it's becomes a derivative here in the American colonies, he's called Quash. Quash, who was known to walk with a gold-headed cane every place he went. Governors from Derby were related. They were family members. Among them, Rosalyn Freeman and Roswell Quash, who will later become Roswell J. Freeman to indicate his free status. There's also Tobias and Eben Tobias Quash, who were also of the Akan lineages, or of the Akan, let me put it in a different way, ethnicity. And so we know that Tobias was described as a man of tact, courage, and unusual intelligence, while Eben was articulate and witty. Moreover, an enslaved man could not run for governor or king unless his master was socially prominent or had the financial resources to support his bid for office. Negro elections were far different than those held by whites. Weeks of politicking took place as well before the election on the day after white elections in Connecticut. The candidates even had a debate between themselves, making speeches as well. The actual vote was not always about taking a paper ballot, but it was by voice, who supported this candidate, or lining up behind your candidate. Voting always took place in an open and airy location near shady trees, reminiscent of their African homeland. Just as whites attached the muster training to their election days, so did some Blacks. However, the Black muster trainings were often comical because they were imitating whites for their stiffness and military pretensions during their militia musters. After the winner was announced, African drumming signaled the start of the processional. The new governor made his grand entrance in an outfit borrowed from his enslaver that included his jacket, his sword, and even the horse he rode with his lady sitting in an attached seat. His hair was powdered and styled as he proudly made his entrance. The Negro governor was often escorted by troops of men, his guard, marching 2 by 2, dressed in military style and mounted on horseback as he led the inaugural parade. The inaugural dinner was paid for by the enslaver of the newly elected dignitary. With his lady at his side, the newly elected governor would rise to greet his well-wishers. At this point, the inaugural festivities were started with food, drinking, dancing, playing games, and enjoying loud music on fiddles and banjos and drums. African languages could be heard mixed with broken English, and it filled the air. This fun and jubilant time could last for up to 5 or more days. In 1758, the residents of Salem, Massachusetts demanded a law be passed to bring an end to all that beating of the drums and the discharging of guns during the Negro election celebration. And so we don't have any images of the Negro governors, but this is one I think that has circulated quite a lot to kind of signify what that Negro governor might have looked like on the horse, in the outfits that were borrowed, the ladies dressed in their Sunday best, parading through the streets. It's interesting because they say that the parades of the Negro governor that took place were had an impact on how white elections would be organized later on. So you didn't have parades until Negro governors began this tradition of having parades. And now, you know, we have parades for everything. And so they kind of contributed that to politics. These large festive occasions were authentic displays of indigenous African customs from the wearing of fancy clothes, the strutting of parades, and the array of African dancing. These African-inspired celebrations took place in a world that oppressed enslaved people every day of their lives. However, on election day, the world turned upside down because enslaved people in New England gathered for food, fun, and fellowship outside the watchful eyes of the people who enslaved them. Once elected, the Negro governor was called on to perform important functions within his community. Since this position commanded respect from Blacks and whites alike, the governor, the Negro governor, served as a mediator, a liaison with other whites who held people in bondage, and sometimes as a judge. Depending on the severity of the crime, enslaved people could face justice in the courts of the Negro governor and not in white courts. In Newport, Rhode Island, the Negro governor heard cases on appeal from his lower branch of magistrates and judges. These Black magistrates tried, condemned, and punished at their own discretion. This was not unlike West Africa, where a council of elders appointed by the chief adjudicated legal matters pertaining to the village. In one case, King Nero in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, handed down a sentence of 20 lashes to a defendant who was alleged to have stolen an axe. The king's deputy sheriff executed the lashes. However, when the thefts continued, it was the king's high sheriff who turned this case over to the white county court. The decisions of these Negro courts, however, took place under the watchful eye of whites, who ultimately determined if the violations were being handled appropriately by these Black jurors. Negro elections was a time free of restraint when Black New Englanders could gather, select, and honor their leaders in celebrations shaped by their own African culture. Remembering their African heritage in this way allowed Black New Englanders to share their culture with their younger generation. This African-style tradition of electing leaders continued into the 19th century when slavery was being slowly dismantled in New England. And so this is a list, a growing list of Negro governors in Connecticut. I want to thank Nicole Thomas for being in touch with me, as well as another gentleman, and I can't think of his name right now, who's been writing me on Facebook Messenger. Don't forget Hercules. Don't forget Hercules, because we believe Hercules is the first Negro governor, or what we have knowledge of right now, because we have evidence that his wife, Florio probably, died in 1749 in Derby. No, in New London, I take that back. In New London. And if she died in 1749, then he might have been a Negro governor before 1750. And so we have the list, Hartford, who has several Negro governors. We know that when you're looking for that African connection, when you see names like Qua, Trow, Cuff for Cuffy, Kofi in the Akan language, Quash as well. That's is indication that they are the Akan ethnicity out of what was called the Gold Coast in the 1700s, but will become Ghana as we know it. And so this is a gravestone that I believe in Hartford that memorializes 300 or more African Americans, including the free, enslaved, and the 5 Black governors who rest in unmarked graves in Hartford's ancient burying ground. I talked about Boston Trow of Newark, and his headstone reads, "In memory of Boston Trow, governor of ye African tribe." You know, I found that so significant. He's not saying governor of this slave community in Newark. He's saying, I'm governor of an African tribe who died on May 18, 1772 at 66. And I just have a small note that he was enslaved by Jabez Huntington, one of this town's most successful West Indian trade merchants. William Lansin, this is the man of the hour. And I'm going to talk a little bit. I think there's so much information out here on William Lansin that most of you probably know it and know more than I do. So thank you for introducing me to William Lansin. What a remarkable man who did so much for his town of New Haven, but also for the African American community in New Haven. And so when I just wanted to list some of the poignant characteristics of William Lansin, there's some question of, was he free or was he slave? But I think there's enough evidence that we believe he was enslaved. Master builder. I'm sure he didn't go to school to be an engineer, but he was able to perform work like an engineer. He contracted with companies to complete projects. Property owner, he tried to buy up a lot of property so that he could provide housing and businesses for his New Guinea community, where most African Americans lived in New Haven. Entrepreneur as well, had many projects. Even toward the end of his life, he was thinking about a delivery type business with sail ships. So always thinking of businesses. Supporter, no greater supporter of his community than you could find. Abolitionists hid African Americans so that they could find freedom. Civil rights activists. And so we'll talk about this, an elected legal governor in 1825. So let's just talk about William Lansin, and I'll close out the talk, and I'm sure there's going to be question and answers that. Okay, so let's talk about William Lansin. Now I said that there's a question about whether he was born in freedom or enslaved, but it's believed that he was born maybe in Derby, maybe in Waterbury. The year is not definitive. One document says 1776, another one says 1785, but we know he's in New Haven by 1803. He's a young man in New Haven. Now, Lansin is living at a time when slavery was alive and well in Connecticut in the early 1800s. We know slavery ended in Massachusetts in 1783, but Connecticut was a little slow under their gradual abolition statute to end slavery. So we know that the Gradual Emancipation Law issued on March 1st, 1784, said all children born after that date, March 1st, 1784, were to be freed when they turned 21 if you're female, or 25 if you're male. And so adults languished in slavery unless their enslavers freed them and they self-emancipated themselves, ran away, and a lot did run away. There were 1,000 enslaved persons in Connecticut in 1800 because legally slavery did not end in Connecticut until 1848. Lansin was educated. We don't know how he was self-educated because he co-authored a petition. He co-authored a petition contesting the termination of voting rights for Black men in 1814. Now we know after the Revolution that slavery is ending in the North, and when slavery ends in places like Massachusetts, Black men can vote. And Connecticut had given Black men that right, and they take it away in 1814. And Lansin, along with another gentleman, let's see if I have that. Another gentleman, they write this petition to the Connecticut General Assembly demanding that they have the right to vote. If you're going to tax me, then I should be able to vote. And so they'll use the cry of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. I can't vote, then you can't tax me. Of course, the petition is going to be ignored by the Assembly. Black men in Connecticut do not get the vote back until the 15th Amendment in 1865. Lansin is going to, he's most known for first, oh, I don't know my slides. Okay, I thought I had a slide of the Long Wharf, but I guess I don't. So he is first going to build an extension, over 1,000 feet extension to the Long Wharf to make it easier for large cargo ships to dock there. He said he was able to do this project because of his ability to use his transport boat. So he had several transport boats to carry 25,000 tons of stones to build this extension. He had an African-American crew that helped him, and they often worked late into the night to get this job done. With all the cash and credit he needed, Lansin, the entrepreneur, came forth, buying all the property that he could through the predominantly Black neighborhood known as New Guinea, where he owned a livery, a store, a stable, tenement housing, and a hotel. Now, I couldn't find the hotel, of course, but this was a hotel called the Union Hotel in New Haven that's built in 1830, around the time that Lansin lived. And what's interesting about this hotel, I wanted to say, well, what does hotel look like in 1830? This hotel will later become the Crandall School that was open to accept African Americans. So it was kind of significant, and I thought I would share this picture, even though this is not his hotel. So New Guinea is this community that you see on my left. where African Americans lived. We know in the late 1800s, African Americans will be pushed out of this area so Wooster Square could be built. And I'm sure you know that neighborhood. So in 1825, Lansin and his African American crew were hired to construct the New Haven end of the Farmington Canal. Once again, his employees carried stone to build this section of the canal, building retaining walls over 1,000 feet long, but he never received his total compensation for this project, but he made sure he paid his workers. In 1825, William Lansin was elected Negro governor of New Haven, an honor given to this very devoted member of the Black community. He helped to organize the African Ecclesiastical Society in 1820, which later became the Dixwell Congregational Church of the United Church of Christ. And it was interesting when I was reading about this, they say that Dixwell is the oldest Black congregation in the world, United Church of Christ congregation in the world. I was quite impressed with that. Lansin will help shelter runaways on the Underground Railroad. He fought for voting rights for men. Praised by Reverend Timothy Wright, bestowed on Governor Lansin, said he was honorable proof of character. And his acceptance into the New Haven business community was only for a fleeting moment. Because in the wake of the Nat Turner revolt in Southampton, Virginia in 1831, a tide turned against African Americans in New Haven. After all, Connecticut was a slaveholding state at the time of Nat Turner's rebellion. Support for the freedom of African Americans in Connecticut waned, and so did plans for a Black college that was being considered by religious leaders and abolitionists. More highly priced homes were being built too close to New Guinea for comfort. A wave of European immigrants displaced African Americans from the domestic and skilled trades they had held for decades. And to add to the burning fires of racism was the American Colonization Society that saw free Blacks as a danger to enslaved populations, because if enslaved people could see that there was a possibility I could get free, like the free Blacks, they were going to try and take it. So they were considered a danger. And so there was increased pressure on African Americans to just go back to Africa. You can go back to Liberia, where an American colony had been set up. The capital of Liberia today, Monrovia, is named for our 5th president, James Monroe. And so you see the status of elite Americans that supported this forced return and this forced removal of free African Americans back to Africa. But why would they go back to Africa, a place they don't even know? We're talking about 1800s. Africans had been in America since the 1600s, 2 centuries. They didn't speak the language. They wouldn't know the foods. And so many said no, adding that why should I have to leave a country that I helped build? there was something really unfair. Only 20,000, I think. Some African Americans just gave up on America. They said, I'll never find freedom. I'll never find equality. So let me try Africa. And so all of this taking place, Nat Turner, ACS, it's a changed time for William Lansin. And so his good fortune begins to spiral downward to the point of no return. Not only was he accused of being a negative and disorderly influence on the very people he had personally harbored from slave catchers, provided housing and employed in jobs he created. The authorities accused Lansin of being connected to illegal activities like prostitution and theft. He denies these allegations in a letter that he writes in the Columbia Register in 1829, in which he expresses confidence still in his people to be smart and industrious despite their poverty, lack of jobs, poor education, and crime-ridden neighborhoods that they have to live with poor whites. So all of these problems in the neighborhood were not all due to African Americans. But the authorities will not let up with their surveillance and their investigations until Lansin is arrested, convicted, and sentenced for 6 months in 1845 for causing so much trouble in this city. William Lansin was no longer the proud Negro governor of New Haven. Racist rhetoric and ridiculing ruled the day. Forced out of Wooster Square to the northeastern part of the town, where he opened his Liberian Hotel, relocated his hostelry with plans to do further construction projects. However, these dreams never became a reality when mounting debt, an ill wife, and personal health problems spiraled into such a decline that he not only lost all of his properties, but was now in a state of perpetual poverty. William Lansin, Negro governor to his people, from 1825 to 1832, passed away in 1851 after years of daring to exercise his right as an American citizen to vote and to be a part of the business community, while also being a religious and concerned individual who only wanted to provide economic opportunities to his people who had escaped the chains of slavery and was just trying to enjoy this little taste of freedom. I just want to make sure I showed all my slides. There's one slide, I think. This is an advertisement of William Lansin advertising some of the goods that he had for sale, horses, gigs, and carriages. But I also skipped over, it's hard when you try, I also skipped over this derby around to just kind of focus in on where they think that William Lansin was born. And I just want to call attention to this picture. This woman is Rosalyn Freeman, the Black governor of Derby. This is his wife. So she has a connection to the Black governors. So thank you for your time. And I will entertain questions if you have them.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. That was fascinating. We actually had an opinion, and some of our attendees are going back and forth, and maybe you can weigh in. It started with someone asking, why did whites in the North not impose the same severe punishments that occurred in the South? And so we have people going back and forth with opinions. Maybe you can weigh in.
Punishment of enslaved people?
Yes.
Why do you think that they didn't impose strenuous punishments on enslaved people in the North? What makes you think that?
We had somebody who mentioned gradual emancipation laws of New England that the South did not offer.
Okay, so all of the North after the American Revolution is moving towards freedom. You have to understand that slavery in New England and the northern states was not the same type of slavery that was in the South. And so you had a different structure of slavery. It's not that it's different, but it's not necessarily more benign than slavery in the South. African Americans got whipped. So did white people get whipped during this time, but African Americans got whipped. You know, some of them were starved. There's a story of a woman in New Hampshire, a young girl, and she's told to go out and find a cow. It's dead of winter in New Hampshire. And she can't find this cow. I don't think she had on any shoes. And she goes out and she goes out and she's literally frozen to death because she can't find this cow in the North. And so, yes, even though there are no plantations in the North, even though the numbers are smaller, we estimate maybe 20,000 total, because the 1750 census says it's about 17,000. But the 1750 census that was done of enslaved people in New England do not count children over 16. So that whole youth population, or under 16, under 16, was not counted. And so you can say 17,000, I think it's more than that, 20, 25,000. But it's a different form of slavery. But any slavery is oppressive. You're telling me I can't do anything unless I get permission. You're telling me that I can't even live with my spouse. In New England, most enslavers wanted one or two people. It's domestic form of slavery. Most are working in the house or small farms. The men are going on errands, working at the harbor. So you don't need a lot of this. So married couples couldn't even live together. Children were given away like they were puppies. And so any slavery system is oppressive. And in New England, the North, you can't justify and think it was not as bad as the South, because any slavery is bad to me. So that's my commentary on that question.
Actually, quite a few that have posted have kind of indicated what you said.
Yeah.
Can't really compare the New England
Yeah.
slave experience to the ones in the South.
Yeah, because there's a really good book by someone from New England, Joanne Pope Mellish, Disowning Slavery. And basically the argument in that book is that New Englanders want to forget that they had slavery. So they want to disown it. They want to be lauded on their work as being abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison, American Anti-Slavery Society, founded right here in Boston. And so they kind of want to not remember that slave history, but that should not happen. Really good book, Disowning Slavery, Joanne Pope Mellish.
We also had somebody that also recommended a book. It is called The Half Has Never Been Told by Edward Baptist of Cornell.
Excellent. Yeah. Definitely. I have it on my shelf. I can't tell you that. finished it, but I do have it on my shelf. Yeah.
And then a couple of people said the book Complicit also talks about.
Complicity, I think it's called. Yeah, that's pretty good, but that is not historians. That's like reporters, I think, that write it. But the whole idea is that New England was complicit in the Southern slavery system because all of that cotton after 1800, that's going to be grown in the Southern plantations in Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, all of that cotton that's grown, that's shipped across the world. A lot of it is shipped to Massachusetts because they had textile factories. So the North is complicit in perpetuating slavery in the South. If you are building your wealth in factories that use slave-grown cotton, that's the gist of complicit.
We had a couple of questions that I'm going to kind of incorporate as one. You had said that the celebrations were 5 days long.
Okay.
Were the 4 or 5 days attended mostly by free Black people? Because her understanding is that the slaves had Sundays off.
Okay, so I guess I don't understand the question. Who's attending these 5 days of celebration?
Yes, and I'm also going to ask about the women. Did the women?
Wait. Let me answer. Okay, so depending on which town, it might be 5 days. It could have been shorter, and maybe in some other towns, but it's attended by everybody. Black, white, slave free. The world turns upside down. So for these 5 days, enslaved Africans have the stage. And whites are there. I didn't get into, they kind of get into, they're so like, this is our time, that they'll ridicule whites, right there in front of them, comically, being very comically about it. But yeah, so whites come, they support it, they know that this is their time and they're there. So everybody attends it. Okay. But I don't know what you were saying about Sundays off. Yeah, generally you had Sundays off, but it's always open to be changed by, the person in charge.
And we have a question about women. Did they go to the Negro governor celebrations?
Oh, yeah. Didn't I show you the picture with the women in the back in their finest dresses? Definitely. Yeah. Who's doing the cooking? Who's doing the dancing? The women. They might not be doing the elections, but even in Africa, I know the Akan culture a little better than I know, other cultures, because I've been to Ghana like 4 times, but the women are not the chiefs, the women are not the elders, women are not the kings, but the queen mother in the Akan religion helps select who the chief or the king is going to be. So women had a little role. But you got to understand, now I'm going to put my teaching mode on, my hat on. Women in New England slavery, most of them are relegated to the house. They're servants, domestic servants. Now you say, oh, they might have it easy, because in the South, if you're in a house slave, then your life is a little easier than working in the fields, in tobacco fields or rice paddies, the way rice is grown in water. That's not easy to have to work in. But in the North, most women are domestics. So, they might have they don't have an easy life. When you're a domestic in a home, you're on call 24/7. Somebody, baby is sick in the night. It's the enslaved woman who got to get up and get that baby. Mm-hmm. You're cooking, you're cleaning, you're taking care of the children. Your life is not hard. Women are relegated to the house. enslaved men have more freedom of movement. They're errand boys, they're coaches. Once they drop, that person to wherever appointment, they got the coach, they got time, they can meet with other men. They work on the harbor. They're skilled artisans, so they might work in a shop. So they have more freedom. But women have less freedom in New England slavery because of being a domestic servant.
Speaking of the sailors, we have someone who asked, were the enslaved people were they enslaved if they served as sailors on seagoing ships?
You could be enslaved. You have to have the permission to work there. But if you take someone like Crispus Attucks, who came to Boston because he was like a merchant seaman, he had run away. And he ran 20 years ago. And so he's working as a free person on those ships that he worked on that brought him to Boston. But you could work as a free person. That might be a free man. That's the only work you can get when you're free. But enslaved people work with permission to work.
Somebody asked, you mentioned the Black governors were respected by whites. Could you expand on that?
I said they were respected in their communities. Most of William Lansin, when he's elected in 1825, he's respected by whites and Blacks. And many of them are the enslaved persons of quite elite status people. And so sometimes, having an elite status enslaver, that gives you a little status too. But they wouldn't have been elected in those positions if they didn't have some good traits.
We have somebody who said, you mentioned, hold on. They're coming in very fast.
Oh my.
You mentioned that there were celebratory gunshots during the election of Black governors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you think Blacks can't have guns?
Yes, that's exactly right. Were enslaved people allowed to have firearms?
Okay, so you got to take off your Southern slavery hat, right? So mostly it's Southern enslavers in the South. They don't want guns in their hands because there's more rebellions or conspiracies for a rebellion. I don't know how much your audience know, but Stonewall Rebellion in 1739, Africans from Angola said, okay, we're going to march for our freedom. We're going to kill 20 whites. And then we're going to run to Florida for freedom because the king in Florida said if we make it there, we'd be free. So it's not like the North. The North, enslaved people would have guns for hunting. World War. I'm doing a special program on Blacks in the military, so I got World War II on my mind. But the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord, when members of the militias included Blacks, they had to have guns. Bunker Hill, when more than 150 Blacks were in the militias, they had to have guns. So in the South, even during the Civil War, whites in the South, like, don't put no guns in the hands. The Confederates never had Blacks to fight in their army, ever. And we know that, Blacks were fighting the 54th Mass Regiment, and we know Blacks were fighting. I mean, even in the American Revolution, Blacks were fighting in the militia until George Washington. The Southern commanders didn't want Blacks to fight in the Continental Army, and Washington said, okay, no more Blacks, because in the militias in Lexington and Concord and in Bunker Hill, you could be in your town's militia, Peter Salem, Salem Poor, and they were in the militias. But when the Continental Army was formed, Southern commanders were like, no, no blacks with guns in the Continental Army. But Washington couldn't even get enough recruits that he 6 months later has to say, okay, no enslaved people but free blacks can fight in the Continental Army. So in the North, it's a different relationship with guns than it is with in the South.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
When did the reign of the Negro governors come to an end, and why did it end?
That's a good question. If we go back to I would have to look at, who is it? The last category. I don't know if I can still share. Let's see. Share screen. Okay. I think it is, and that's a good question. I don't know as a research question why Wilson, Weston, and Seymour was the last one. But this is closer to the Civil War, 1855, things are changing. Even people from New England are going to Ohio and Indiana and things like that. So the nation itself is changing. This whole question of whether slavery is going to expand. And I just maybe think it's a tradition that was probably slowly dying out and comes to an end definitely when the war is nearby. That's just off the cuff. I would have to do some research on what was going on that no one was elected after Wilson.
Thank you for answering my question.
Okay.
It seems based on 1855 to be the answer.
Huh? Yeah, that's the answer, but I don't know why that's the answer. Okay.
Well, we're starting to get lots of comments about a wonderful presentation.
Oh,
people are thanking you for such a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
And
there's much more research to be done in this area. It's much, I want to know more about Salem and, other places. Even on the Boston Commons, they were electing, I don't know much about that, how that happened. So there's still a lot to uncover. Connecticut just has such a rich history of this tradition. Why that is? Maybe because slavery continued longer there. I don't know, why, but they just have a rich history with it, and so much we have learned about that time period and how enslaved people lived through this institution that they put in place.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for joining us this evening. It's been a wonderful presentation, and we're getting lots of great feedback. And for all of our attendees, I just wanted you to please join us on Thursday, March 10th for the Way Sisters, Miniaturists of the Early Republic for Women's History Month. And again, that'll be Thursday, March 10th. For all of us at the New Haven Museum, I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Lewis, and I wish you a wonderful evening.
You too, and thank you for letting me share my love of history with you. Bye now.
Good night, everyone.